At 9,000 feet, the wind does more than blow. It screams, tearing at nylon jackets and forcing its way into the lungs until they burn. Beside Beck, a veteran of 2 wars named Blake chewed a stale piece of gum and shook his weathered head. "It's a wash, Cross," he muttered. "Wind's too erratic. No one makes a 3-mile shot in this." Beck simply adjusted her scope and smiled, ignoring the copper taste of her split lip. The smell of the hide was the first thing that broke them down. It wasn't the romanticized scent of pine needles or crisp mountain air. It was the sharp ammonia tang of their own stale sweat, mingled with the metallic odor of gun oil and the synthetic stench of the plastic bags they used for their waste. They had been wedged between 2 jagged slabs of limestone for 74 hours. Beck's right hip was bruised purple from pressing against a rock. She couldn't move without compromising their camouflage. Thomas Blake shifted beside her, the movement so microscopic that anyone else wouldn't have noticed. But when you share a space the size of a shallow grave for 3 days, you feel every breath your partner takes. "Wind is shifting again," Blake whispered. His voice was gravelly, dry. He hadn't taken a proper drink of water in 6 hours, rationing their supply. "I see it," she murmured back. Her lips were chapped to the point of cracking. When she spoke, a tiny bead of blood welled up, leaving a warm copper taste on her tongue. She was Rebecca Cross. Her team just called her Beck. The brass called her an experiment, a milestone, a headline waiting to happen. The first female SEAL sniper to be deployed in this specific, highly classified theater. She hated it. She didn't want to be a pioneer. Pioneers catch arrows. She just wanted to be the weapon. But lying there, freezing half to death in a forgotten mountain range in Eastern Europe, the weight of being the first was a heavy, suffocating blanket. If a male sniper missed this shot, it was the wind's fault. If she missed, it was her gender's fault. It was an unfair, cynical reality, but it was the one she lived in. Blake tapped his Kestrel wind meter. The digital display flickered in the low light of the dawn. "We've got crosswinds in the valley, moving left to right at roughly 12 knots down here. But look at the dust kicking up on the second ridge. That's a downdraft. God knows what it's doing in the dead zone." The dead zone. That was the stretch of air spanning the ravine between their mountain and the compound. It was a 3-mile gap of invisible, churning violence. Her weapon lay in front of her, a custom-built, extreme long-range platform chambered in a proprietary .416 Wildcat cartridge. It was heavy, brutal, and utterly unforgiving. The barrel was thick, fluted to dissipate heat, though out here the cold was sinking into the metal so deeply it felt sticky to the touch. She ran her bare trigger finger along the trigger guard, feeling the icy bite. "You're cramping," Blake said, his eye never leaving his spotting scope. "I'm fine. Your breathing is shallow. Your shoulder is tense. You're cramping, Cross." He wasn't judging. He was stating facts. Blake was a machine of empirical data. He was a veteran who had survived Fallujah and Kunar by trusting numbers and rejecting hope. Hope got you killed. Math brought you home. She forced a slow, agonizing breath into her lower abdomen, expanding her diaphragm, fighting the instinct to shiver. The cold was a physical weight, pressing down on her spine. She uncurled her toes inside her boots, feeling the familiar, terrifying numbness setting in. "Just focus on the optic, Tommy," she breathed, shifting her weight a fraction of an inch to let blood flow back into her hip. "I'm focusing. I'm looking at a valley of bad news. 3 miles, Beck. 5,280 yards. The bullet flight time alone is going to be nearly 10 seconds. In 10 seconds, A man can tie his shoe, pour a cup of coffee, or walk behind a concrete wall. In 10 seconds, this wind can change direction 3 times. He was right. The sheer physics of the shot bordered on the absurd. At this distance, they weren't just fighting wind and gravity. They had to account for the Coriolis effect, the actual rotation of the Earth beneath the bullet as it flew. They had to account for spin drift, aerodynamic jump, the barometric pressure, the humidity, and the temperature of the powder inside the brass casing. It was a math problem with too many variables and no constant. "We wait," she said, her voice flatter than she felt. Inside, her stomach was a tight, coiled knot of anxiety. She was terrified, not of the enemy. She was terrified of failure. She was terrified that Blake was right, that the veterans back at the armory who had scoffed at this mission. Parameters were right. Too far, too windy, too much to leave up to chance. But she didn't voice it. She let the cold air sting her eyes, staring through the glass at the distant, blurry shapes of the compound, waiting for the devil to show his face. The sun crested the jagged peaks behind them, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley floor. With the sun came the mirage. Even in the freezing cold, the heat differential between the warming rocks and the icy air created a shimmering distortion. Through her high-powered optic, the target compound 3 miles away looked like it was underwater. The concrete walls rippled and danced. "Activity at the main building," Blake said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into his operational cadence. 3 armed tangos stepping out. A K platforms. They're scanning." Beck tracked her reticle across the compound. The magnification was dialed all the way up, but at 3 miles, a human being is just a speck, a tiny smudge against the reticle's hash marks. "I see them," she said. "Where is he?" Patience. Dominic Royce wasn't a warlord in the traditional bombastic sense. He didn't wear gold chains or carry a gold-plated sidearm. He was a former intelligence officer who had gone rogue, taking a massive cache of stolen NATO weaponry and carving out a bloody fiefdom in these mountains. He was smart, paranoid, and utterly ruthless. And he was currently brokering a deal to sell chemical agents to a proxy group that would see thousands of civilians dead before the month was out. Taking him out wasn't about justice. It was a cold, calculated amputation to save the rest of the body. "Vehicle approaching from the north side," Blake noted. "Armored SUV, black." The vehicle rolled into the courtyard, its tires kicking up a plume of grey dust. Through the mirage, the dust looked like a slow-motion explosion. "Watch the wind on that dust," she said. "I see it. Left to right, kicking hard. Then it stalls and plumes straight up. It's a blender out there, Beck. The bullet is going to drop below the speed of sound at around the 2-mile mark. When it goes transonic, the shockwave is going to destabilize it. With this wind, it's going to tumble. It's going to fly like a thrown brick." Blake was looking for an out. He was trying to give her permission to scrub the mission. It was the veteran in him trying to protect the rookie. He knew the backlash she'd face if she took the shot and missed, alerting Royce and sending him underground forever. If they aborted due to weather, it was an act of God. If she missed, it was an act of incompetence. "Vehicle doors opening," she said, ignoring his out. Her heart rate began to slow. This was the contradiction of her existence. She was a bundle of nerves in the downtime, plagued by imposter syndrome, haunted by the side-eyes in the mess hall. But the moment the target presented itself, a cold, empty silence washed over her brain. The anxiety didn't vanish. It just compartmentalized, shoved into a heavy iron box in the back of her mind. A figure stepped out of the SUV. Even through the wavy, distorted air, the posture was distinct. rigid, authoritative. "Confirming target," Blake said, his breathing shallowing out. "It's Royce. He's wearing the grey overcoat. He's speaking to the guards." Beck settled her crosshairs on the grey smudge. Her cheek welded to the cold composite stock of the rifle. The vibrations of her own pulse thumped softly against the bone of her jaw. She adjusted her breathing, timing the pauses between inhales with the thud of her heart. "Distance to target, 5,282 yards, Blake read from the laser rangefinder, double-checking the ballistic computer strapped to his wrist. "Elevation is dialed, but Beck, the wind call is a guess. It's an educated guess, but it's still a guess." She looked at the mirage. She looked at the dust. She looked at the way the scrub brush on the first ridge was leaning, and how the snow blowing off the second peak was swirling in a counter-clockwise vortex. It wasn't just math. It was a feeling. It was hours spent staring at wind patterns until they started to look like sheet music. "Give me a dial, Tommy," she said. Blake was silent for 3 long seconds. She could hear the grinding of his teeth. "I can't," he finally said. "I can't give you a firing solution I don't believe in. You're going to miss by 30 feet, Cross. The wind is too strong, and it's too broken. If you pull that trigger, we compromise the op, and he gets away." Her finger rested lightly on the trigger shoe. The metal was freezing. Her lungs ached for a full breath. She stared at the grey smudge 3 miles away. He was smoking a cigarette. She couldn't see the smoke, but she knew his file. He always smoked a clove cigarette after a long drive. A cynical voice in her head sounded exactly like the instructors back in Coronado. "She doesn't have the discipline to abort. She's going to force it to prove a point." She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She listened to the wind howling over their limestone cover. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was pressure. It was a fluid. "I'm not forcing it," she whispered, realizing she had spoken out loud. "What?" Blake asked. "Hold my legs," she said. "When you shoot extreme long range, the recoil of the rifle can shift the body just enough to throw off the follow-through. A shooter needs to be a rock." She needed Blake to literally pin her legs to the earth to absorb the massive shockwave of the .416 round. "Beck, listen to me. Hold my legs, Tommy." He sighed, a heavy, tired sound, and she felt his weight shift as he slid back, pressing his heavy boots against her calves, locking her into the stone. "I'm dialing," she said. She reached up with her left hand, keeping her eye in the optic. Her fingers were stiff, clumsy from the cold, but muscle memory took over. She clicked the elevation turret. Click, click, click. The mechanical sounds were deafening in the quiet space between the wind gusts. She bypassed the ballistic computer's recommendation. The computer was looking at the wind at their position and the wind at the target. It couldn't comprehend the dead zone. "What are you dialing?" Blake asked, his voice tight. 22 mils left," she said. 22? "Beck, the computer says 14. You're overcompensating. You're going to push it right into the side of the mountain." "The computer doesn't see the canyon draft," she said. Her voice was eerily calm. It wasn't bravado. It was a weird, detached acceptance. She was looking at the canyon below. There was a topographical funnel there. The wind was being squeezed through a narrow rock face about 2 miles out, accelerating the air mass like water through a nozzle. The bullet would hit that invisible wall of air right as it began to slow down. If she dialed 14 miles, the bullet would be swept 50 feet off target. "You're guessing," Blake warned. "I'm interpolating." She settled back in, her eye aligned perfectly with the scope shadow. The grey smudge of Dominic Royce was standing still. He was looking at something on a clipboard held by one of his guards. 10 seconds. A 10-second flight time. She needed to predict where he would be and what the wind would be doing, 10 seconds in the future. It was an act of arrogance to think a human could do that, and right then, despite the freezing cold, despite the bruising on her hip, despite the absolute absurdity of the situation, she smiled. It wasn't a heroic smile. It wasn't a smirk of cocky confidence. It was a raw, imperfect, slightly unhinged reaction to the immense pressure. She was a speck of dust on a mountain, about to unleash a tiny piece of metal into a chaotic void, hoping to strike another speck of dust 3 miles away. It was so deeply, profoundly ridiculous that her brain had short-circuited into amusement. Her lips cracked further, and the copper taste flooded her mouth again. "You're smiling," Blake noted, sounding mildly horrified. "Why are you smiling?" "Because the wind is too strong, Tommy." She exhaled. Not all the way. She emptied her lungs to the natural respiratory pause, that brief window where the body isn't working to take air in or push it out. The heart slows, the muscles relax. She took the slack out of the trigger. 2 pounds of pressure. Through the scope, the world narrowed down to the crosshairs. The mirage swayed. The dust kicked. "Send it." She pressed the trigger straight to the rear. The rifle didn't just fire, it detonated. A concussive blast of expanding gases and fire erupted from the muzzle brake, kicking up a storm of limestone dust and snow around their hide. The recoil slammed backward like a mule kick, traveling through the heavy stock, into her shoulder and down her spine. Had Blake not been anchoring her legs, she would have slid backward 6 inches. The sound was a physical blow, a deafening crack that echoed off the canyon walls, rolling like thunder down the valley. But she didn't blink. Through the violent recoil, she forced her eye to stay in the optic, fighting to acquire the target through the disruption. "Shot away," Blake said, his voice instantly dropping all emotion, acting purely as a spotter now. "Time of flight, 9.8 seconds. 1. She watched the grey smudge. Royce was still looking at the clipboard. He hadn't heard the shot. Sound takes time. At 3 miles, the sound of the rifle would take over 14 seconds to reach him. By the time he heard it, he would already be dead. Or she would have missed. 2. The bullet was climbing now, arcing high into the atmosphere, slicing through the thin mountain air at 3,000 feet per second. 3. "Wind is picking up at the midway point," Blake whispered. 4. Her shoulder throbbed. The smell of burnt powder filled the hide, sharp and acrid, cutting through the smell of sweat and cold. 5. The bullet was at the apex of its trajectory, 100 feet above the line of sight, beginning its long, brutal descent. 6. It was entering the canyon draft, the invisible nozzle. Her 22 mil hold was either a stroke of genius or the dumbest mistake of her career. 7. Royce moved. Her stomach dropped into her boots. Through the scope, the grey smudge shifted to the left, taking a half step toward the armoured SUV. "Target shifting," Blake said flatly. 8. He had moved maybe 2 feet. At 3 miles, a 2-foot deviation was the difference between a centre mass hit and a clean miss into the dirt. She felt a cold sweat break out on her neck, instantly freezing in the biting wind. 9. The bullet was going subsonic, the sonic boom catching up to the projectile, rocking it, threatening to tumble it out of the sky. 10. The stillness after a shot like that doesn't last. Reality comes crashing back in a wave of adrenaline, cold sweat, and ringing ears. "We're leaving Beck and Blake on that mountain for now," watching the glass, waiting for the impact in the chaotic winds. But the story is far from over. What happens when the bullet covers those 3 miles of screaming wind? If you want to hear the rest of Beck's impossible shot and the chaotic fallout, you know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who appreciates a story with real grit. Part 4 is coming soon. 10. The human brain is a terrible timekeeper in a crisis. Those 10 seconds didn't stretch, they fractured. She didn't see the bullet fly. You never do. She just watched the grey smudge in the optic, acutely aware of the violent, invisible river of air tearing through the valley between them. Dominic Royce took another half step, pivoting toward the open door of the armoured SUV. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that his death had already left the barrel, that a 400-grain chunk of spun copper was currently plunging out of the stratosphere, cutting through the canyon draft exactly where she had gambled it would. Then the physics caught up with the flesh. It wasn't theatrical. There was no dramatic backward throw, no Hollywood spray of crimson. At extreme long range, a heavy solid copper projectile, moving at transonic speeds, doesn't punch a neat hole. It transfers thousands of foot-pounds of kinetic energy in a fraction of a millisecond. Through the glass, the grey smudge just ceased to be a vertical shape. Royce crumpled inward, instantly collapsing like a marionette with its strings brutally severed. He dropped straight down onto the dusty concrete. A split second later, a sickening plume of dust and pulverized concrete kicked up directly behind where he had been standing, marking the bullet's impact into the earth. The round had passed entirely through him and cratered the ground. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, the compound remained perfectly still. The guards were looking at him, confused, their brains unable to process why their boss had suddenly folded into a pile of grey wool and meat on the ground. Then the sound arrived. The rolling, thunderous crack of the .416 Wildcat echoed down the valley, a delayed auditory ghost of the violence that had just occurred. The compound exploded into motion. The guards didn't know where the shot came from. The acoustic delay and the bouncing echoes off the limestone made pinpointing their hide impossible. They just started firing blindly into the surrounding ridges. Tiny, frantic muzzle flashes sparked from their AKs, completely useless at a 3-mile distance. They were shooting at shadows. Beside her, Blake hadn't moved a muscle. He was still locked into the spotting scope, his breathing utterly controlled. "Target is down," he said. His voice was a flat, mechanical drone. No movement. Blood pooling on the concrete. "That's a catastrophic central nervous system hit. You took his spine out, Cross." She didn't answer. She couldn't. The iron box in the back of her mind, the one holding the anxiety, the cold, the sheer crushing pressure, sprang open. The adrenaline dump was immediate and vicious. Her vision swam, the edges of the optic blurring into a vignette of dark grey. Her hands, rock steady a moment ago, began to shake so violently she could hear her fingernails chattering against the trigger guard. She sucked in a lungful of the freezing air, but it felt like breathing through a wet wool blanket. She tasted bile rising in the back of her throat. She rolled her head off the cheek weld, squeezed her eyes shut, and dry-heaved into the snow beside the rifle. Nothing came up but a string of yellow, acidic spit. "Hey," Blake said. She felt his heavy, gloved hand grip the back of her neck. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't say "good shot" or "you did it." He just gripped her neck, grounding her, forcing her frantic brain to register a physical sensation other than panic. "Breathe, Beck. Count the seconds. 1, 2, 3. She followed his voice, sucking the thin air through her nose, forcing it down into her trembling diaphragm. The metallic tang of the split lip was still there, now mixed with the sour taste of stomach acid. "I'm good," she gasped, lying to both of them. Her hip was screaming in agony now that the tension was broken. "No, you're in shock. It's normal," Blake said, his tone shifting from spotter to senior operator. "But we're out of time for it. They don't know where we are yet, but Royce's boys aren't amateurs. They're going to calculate the angle of the entry wound, look at the topography, and draw a line straight to this ridge. We have maybe 20 minutes before they start dropping mortars on this grid." He released her neck and started moving. After 74 hours of utter stillness, the sudden flurry of motion in the hide felt chaotic. Beck reached forward and worked the massive bolt of the rifle. The extraction was stiff. The metal expanded from the heat of the blast. She yanked it back, and the massive brass casing ejected, tumbling onto the rock. It was smoking, smelling of burnt carbon and ammonia. She grabbed it with her bare hand. The metal seared her palm, a sharp, grounding pain that finally cut through the adrenaline haze. She shoved the empty brass deep into her chest pocket. A sniper never leaves brass behind. It's a signature. It's evidence. "Break it down," Blake ordered, collapsing his spotting scope and stuffing it into his canvas drag bag. She forced her screaming joints to cooperate. Her knees popped like dry kindling as she shifted backward. She folded the bipod of the rifle, the metal icy and slick with condensation. The weapon weighed 32 pounds. Right then, it felt like it weighed 300. They didn't speak. They didn't celebrate. They were two frozen, filthy mechanics packing up their tools after completing a deeply ugly job. Below them, the faint popping sounds of gunfire continued to echo from the valley floor. They were still shooting at ghosts. But Blake was right. The math that had allowed her to kill Dominic Royce was the same math that would lead his lieutenants right to them. She secured the rifle in the drag bag, strapped it across her back, and slung her M4 carbine over her chest. She looked at the spot where they had lain for 3 days. 2 shallow indentations in the dirt, surrounded by human waste bags and empty water bladders. It looked pathetic. "Ready?" Blake asked, his face smeared with camouflage paint and dirt, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. "Ready. Then let's disappear." Exfiltration is always the worst part of the job. The target is down, the psychological peak has been reached, and the body just wants to shut down. But this is the exact moment when the environment tries its hardest to kill you. They couldn't take the ridgeline back to the extraction point. It would skyline them against the rising sun, making them perfect silhouettes for anyone looking up from the valley. They had to go down the backside of the mountain, dropping 2,000 feet into a narrow, shadowed gorge before cutting north. The backside of the mountain wasn't dirt. It was scree, a steeply angled field of loose, sharp limestone shale that shifted and slid with every step. "Keep your profile low," Blake hissed over the howling wind, already sliding over the edge. "Use your heels. Don't fight the slide. Ride it." She followed him over the lip. The moment her boots hit the shale, the entire surface gave way. It sounded like thousands of breaking plates. She dropped low, essentially crouching, letting her weight carry her down. The 32-pound rifle on her back threw her center of gravity completely off. She slid 10 yards, 15 yards, the sharp rocks tearing at the heavy cordura nylon of her pants. She hit a larger, embedded boulder and jarred to a halt. The impact shot a spike of agonizing pain up her already bruised hip. She bit her tongue to keep from crying out, tasting fresh blood. "Keep moving," Blake grunted from below her. They scrambled like crabs down the face of the mountain. It wasn't tactical or slick. It was desperate, ugly work. Her lungs burned, begging for oxygen in the thin air. Beneath the layers of Gore-Tex and fleece, she was sweating profusely, the cold sweat sticking to her skin, a dangerous precursor to hypothermia if they had to stop for too long. Thump. A heavy, hollow sound echoed from the far side of the valley, cutting through the wind. Blake and Beck both froze. They recognized that sound instantly. It wasn't small arms fire. 82 millimeter, Blake said grimly. They've got a mortar tube up. 5 seconds later, a violent explosion tore into the ridgeline roughly 500 yards to their left. A geyser of black earth, snow, and pulverized rock shot into the sky, followed by the terrifying jagged shriek of shrapnel cutting through the air. "They guessed the wrong ridge," she said, her voice barely a croak. "They'll adjust. They're walking the grid," Blake replied, his eyes scanning the slope below. "We need to get under the defilade. Now, go!" Beck abandoned any attempt at a controlled descent. She threw herself down the scree, sliding on her boots, her gloved hands tearing against the rocks to keep her balance. The shale sliced through her left glove, opening a gash across her palm. She didn't care. The fear was a cold, sharp spur in her ribs. Thump. Another hollow cough from the valley. "Incoming!" Blake yelled. She threw herself flat against the shifting rocks, curling into a fetal position, wrapping her arms around her helmet. The round impacted much closer this time, maybe 200 yards directly above them, striking the lip of the ridge they had just abandoned. The concussive wave hit her like a physical punch to the back, driving the air from her lungs. A shower of dirt and razor-sharp rock fragments rained down on them, pinging off her Kevlar helmet and the heavy drag bag shielding her spine. Ears ringing, mouth full of grit, she pushed herself up. "Tommy!" "I'm up," Blake coughed, emerging from a cloud of dust a few yards away. He was limping heavily on his right leg. His bad knee, the one he always complained about in the armory, had finally given out on the steep grade. "Let me take some of the gear," she shouted, moving toward him. "Don't touch my damn gear, Cross," he snapped, his eyes flashing with a fierce, stubborn pride. "Just keep moving. The gorge is right there." They hit the tree line at the base of the scree slope. The shadowed gorge offered immediate relief from the screaming wind, but the temperature plummeted here, untouched by the morning sun. The snow was thigh-deep, undisturbed. Every step required pulling her leg up out of the heavy snow, stepping forward and sinking back in. It was a miserable, exhausting slog. They walked in silence for 2 hours. The mortar fire had stopped after a dozen rounds. Either Royce's men had lost their suspected position, or they were marshalling a foot patrol to sweep the area. They didn't wait to find out. Beck's mind started to play tricks on her. In the absolute quiet of the snow-draped gorge, her brain kept replaying the image in the scope, the grey smudge folding in on itself. It was a strange, haunting disconnect. She hadn't looked him in the eye. She hadn't smelled his cologne or heard his voice. She had just solved a terribly complex physics equation, pulled a piece of curved metal, and a man 3 miles away ceased to exist. It felt deeply clinical, yet horrifyingly intimate. She knew exactly where the bullet had entered his body. She knew the exact angle of his spine when it severed. "Stop thinking about it," Blake said quietly from behind her. She turned. "I didn't say anything." "You don't have to. I can see the back of your head. You're trying to process the ghost. Don't." Blake leaned against a massive pine tree, catching his breath. His breath plumed in the freezing air. "It's a trap. You start applying humanity to a target, you lose your mind." He was a grid coordinate. You service the coordinate, That's the beginning and the end of it. It doesn't feel like a coordinate, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. The candor surprised her. Usually, in front of the veterans, she maintained a facade of absolute, impenetrable ice. But the cold, the exhaustion, and the shared survival had stripped away the armor. Blake looked at her. Not with pity, but with a weary understanding. It never does, Beck. Not the first time. Not the 50th. You just get better at putting the ghost in a box and burying it in the backyard. Right now, your only job is putting one foot in front of the other until we reach the bird. He pushed off the tree, wincing slightly as he put weight on his bad knee. They walked for another 3 hours. Her body went completely numb. The pain in her hip, the cut on her hand, the burning in her lungs. It all faded into a dull, white noise. She entered a state of robotic automation. Step, breathe, step, breathe. When they finally heard the low, rhythmic whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of the extraction chopper's rotors echoing off the canyon walls, she didn't feel relief. She just felt a profound, heavy emptiness. The MH-60 Blackhawk flared through the treetops, kicking up a massive blizzard of rotor wash. They dragged themselves aboard, collapsing onto the aluminum floor. The crew chief hauled them in and slammed the doors shut. The cabin smelled of JP-8 aviation fuel, hydraulic fluid, and hot metal. It was the smell of safety. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever breathed in. She slumped against the canvas webbing of the seat, closing her eyes as the chopper banked hard, lifting them up and away from the jagged peaks. Beside her, Blake was already asleep, his head resting against the vibrating fuselage, a veteran who knew how to turn off the machine the moment the mission was over. She tried to sleep, but the ghost was already out of the box, sitting quietly in the empty seat across from her. Bagram Airfield smelled like burning trash, diesel exhaust, and stale coffee. It was a sprawling, ugly city of concrete T-walls and canvas tents, humming with the relentless, grinding machinery of an endless war. After dropping their gear at the armory, where the armorer, a cynical staff sergeant named Jenkins, stared at her heavily scored rifle with wide, questioning eyes but said nothing, they were directed straight to the Tactical Operations Center, TOC, for debrief. There were no showers, no medical checks, just the debrief. The TOC was a heavily air-conditioned, windowless room filled with the hum of server racks and the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. It was jarring to be thrust from the violent, freezing reality of the mountain into this sterile, corporate environment. She was still wearing her filthy, torn combat pants. Her face was streaked with dirt and dried blood from her lip. She smelled like ammonia and sweat. Commander Baker sat at the head of a plywood table. He was a sharp, ambitious officer whose uniform never seemed to have a single wrinkle, even in a war zone. Beside him sat 2 intelligence analysts, their laptops open, their expressions neutral. "Take a seat, Chief," Baker said to Blake. He looked at Beck. "Cross." They sat in the cheap plastic folding chairs. Her joints locked up instantly, protesting the sedentary position. "Walk me through the timeline," Baker said, steepling his fingers. "We intercepted radio chatter from the compound indicating panic, followed by disorganized mortar fire. But our drone feed was obscured by cloud cover. Did you acquire the target?" "Target acquired and neutralized," Blake said flatly. "Time of death approximately 07:14 hours local." Baker raised an eyebrow, looking from Blake to her. He was one of the men who had argued against her deployment. He thought the physics of the valley were too extreme, and, unspoken but heavily implied, he thought a female sniper lacked the raw physical endurance and emotional detachment for a 72-hour deep cover hide. "Range," Baker asked. 5,282 yards, she said. Her voice sounded raspy, thin. One of the intel analysts stopped typing. He looked up, his eyes widening. 3 miles? Give or take, she said. Baker leaned forward, his skeptical mask slipping just a fraction. At that range, with the crosswinds in the valley, the ballistic computer wouldn't have been able to generate a reliable firing solution. The probability of a first-round cold-bore hit is statistically 0. He was looking for the lie. He was waiting for Blake to say they got lucky, or he walked into the round. Blake didn't look at Baker. He stared straight ahead at the plywood wall. The computer didn't generate the solution, sir. Cross did. She calculated a 22-mile hold to account for a canyon downdraft at the 2-mile mark. She bypassed the software. Silence fell over the room. The only sound was the hum of the servers. Baker stared at her. It wasn't awe. It was a cold, calculating recalculation of her value as an asset. She wasn't just a headline anymore. She was a terrifyingly efficient piece of hardware. You dialed 22 mils manually? Baker asked, his voice dropping. Yes, sir, she said. If you had miscalculated that draft, the round would have missed by 30 feet. You would have compromised the entire theater operation for a guess. It wasn't a guess, sir. It was an interpolation of the environment. She met his gaze. She felt no triumph. She just felt exhausted. And I didn't miss. Baker stared at her for a long time. Then he nodded once, a sharp, crisp motion. Submit your after-action reports by 1800, he said, standing up. The debrief was over. There was no parade, no applause. A man was dead. The geopolitical chessboard had shifted a fraction of an inch, and the paperwork was due by dinner. Blake and Beck walked out of the TOC into the blinding Afghan sun. The heat hit her like a physical wall, suffocating after days in the freezing cold. He's pissed, Blake said, pulling a crushed pack of cigarettes from his pocket. Why? She asked, squinting against the glare. We got his target. Because you did something he doesn't understand. Brass hates things they can't put in a spreadsheet. You just broke the math, Beck. He lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply, his shoulders finally dropping a fraction of an inch. Tommy, she said, the exhaustion finally pulling her voice down to a whisper. Did I do the right thing? Bypassing the computer, taking that shot. If I had missed, Blake stopped. He turned to her, the smoke curling around his weathered face. He looked incredibly old in the harsh sunlight. You didn't miss, he said quietly. That's the only thing that matters in this life. You didn't miss. He turned and walked towards the barracks, his bad knee causing a pronounced limp. She stood alone in the dust of the airfield. She looked down at her hands. The gash on her left palm was crusted with dried blood. The fingernail on her right index finger, her trigger finger, was bruised black from the recoil. She reached into her chest pocket and pulled out the heavy brass casing of the .416 round. It was cold now. The smell of burnt carbon was gone, replaced by the faint, metallic scent of copper. She rolled it in her palm. It felt incredibly small to have caused so much violence, to have solved such an impossible equation, to have taken a life from 3 miles away. She thought about Dominic Royce folding into the dirt. She thought about the wind screaming over the limestone. And she thought about the ghost she was now going to have to carry in the heavy iron box in the back of her mind. She closed her fist around the brass casing, slipping it back into her pocket. The veterans had said the wind was too strong. They were right. It was, but she had shot through it anyway. She turned and walked toward the showers, desperate to wash the smell of the mountain off her skin, knowing full well that the cold would never entirely leave her bones. The hardest part about coming back isn't the noise, it's the silence. In a combat zone, silence is a localized commodity. It means someone is holding their breath, waiting for a tripwire to snap or a mortar tube to clear. Silence is tension, but in a one-bedroom apartment in San Diego, silence is just a vacuum. It presses against the eardrums until they ring. It had been 4 months since the mountain. Beck's split lip had healed into a thin, white scar that pulled slightly when she drank coffee. Her right hip still clicked when she walked upstairs, a permanent souvenir from the limestone scree slope. She was standing in the center of her kitchen, staring at the synthetic hum of her refrigerator. The air conditioning was set to 68 degrees, but she was sweating. Not the cold, panicked sweat of the hide, but a restless, suffocating heat that came from the inside out. On the kitchen island sat a polished mahogany box. Inside was a Navy Commendation Medal. Next to it was an interdepartmental memo outlining her schedule for the upcoming week. Tuesday, interview with Naval Special Warfare Public Affairs. Wednesday, keynote at the Women in Leadership Defense Summit. Thursday, photo op with the recruiting command. They didn't want a sniper, they wanted a poster. She walked over to the sink, turning on the cold water. She watched it pool around the stainless steel drain. It was so clean, so ridiculously, aggressively clean. She cupped her hands, brought the water to her face, and drank. It tasted like copper. She squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the edge of the granite countertop until her knuckles turned white. It wasn't the water. The water was fine. It was her brain misfiring, dragging the sensory memory of her bleeding lip and the burnt brass of the .416 out of the iron box and shoving it down her throat. "Put it away, Beck," she whispered to the empty room. Her phone buzzed on the counter, vibrating against the granite. She opened her eyes. It was a text from Blake. "Heard they're making you dance for the cameras. Don't trip." Blake had retired 3 weeks after they got back. His knee was bone on bone, and the medical board had given him an ultimatum: take the desk or take the pension. He took the pension and a piece of land in Montana, where the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. She envied him with a bitterness that tasted like ash. He got to walk away. He got to be a grumpy old man in the woods. Because she was the first, she wasn't allowed to walk away. She was property of the narrative. She typed back, "Dancing is for people with intact hips. How's the fish? Fish are stupid. Keep your head down, Cross." She set the phone down and looked at the mahogany box again. Commander Baker had handed it to her in a pristine office overlooking the Pacific Ocean. He had smiled for the photographer, shaking her hand, telling the room about her historic achievement. He hadn't mentioned the canyon draft. He hadn't mentioned the mortars. He hadn't mentioned that for 10 seconds. He and the rest of the brass thought she was an arrogant liability who had just thrown a multi-million-dollar operation into the dirt. They sanitized the violence. They took a chaotic, terrifying, morally ambiguous moment of survival and boiled it down to a glossy 8x10 photograph. She walked into her bedroom and pulled her duffel bag from the closet. She unzipped the side pocket and reached past the rolled-up socks and the spare tourniquets. Her fingers brushed against cold metal. She pulled it out, the brass casing. It was heavy in her palm. The primer was struck, a deep, mechanical dimple in the center of the base. It was unpolished, scored by the violent extraction from the chamber, smelling faintly of old carbon. This was the reality. This ugly, spent piece of metal was the only honest thing she had left of that day. She didn't go to the PAO interview on Tuesday. She didn't go to the summit on Wednesday. Instead, she drove 3 hours east, past the sprawling suburbs and the outlet malls, straight into the punishing, bleached wasteland of the Imperial Valley. She needed to smell dust. She needed to feel the recoil. She needed to remember that she wasn't a poster, she was a weapon. The heat mirage at the Nyland Desert Range didn't ripple like water. It boiled like oil. It was 112 degrees in the shade of the corrugated tin roof covering the firing line. The air was so dry, it felt like it was sucking the moisture directly out of a person's eyeballs. She lay on a torn canvas shooting mat. The familiar heavy bulk of a .338 Lapua Magnum pressed into her shoulder. The caliber was smaller than the .416 she had used on the mountain, but it was still a sledgehammer. Beside her lay Petty Officer Second Class Garrett. He was 23, built like a collegiate swimmer and terrifyingly smart. He was the new breed. He had an app on his phone that could calculate ballistic drag coefficients faster than she could tie her boots. He was also entirely blind to the world around him. Target is the white steel silhouette. Range is 1,400 yards, Garrett said, his eye glued to his spotting scope. He tapped the screen of his Kestrel wind meter, then punched the numbers into his wrist-mounted ballistic solver. Wind is blowing left to right at 4 knots. Temperature is 112. Station pressure is 29.92. Spindrift is 0.2 miles right. Coriolis is 0.1 miles up. He read the data like a robot reading a grocery list. Hold is left 1.2 mils. Elevation is 11.4 mils. Send it when ready, Chief. She didn't move her finger to the trigger. She kept her eye behind the optic, watching the heat waves distort the white steel target 14 football fields away. Look at the mesquite bush at the 800-yard line, Garrett, she said. Her voice was calm, muffled slightly by the foam earplugs and the electronic headset. I see it. It's still. Now look at the dust devil spinning up near the berm at 1200. Garrett shifted his scope. Okay, I see it. Your Kestrel says 4 knots left to right. The dust devil is moving right to left. What does the computer say about that? Garrett frowned, tapping his screen again. The computer assumes a uniform wind vector based on our immediate environment, Chief. It interpolates based on terrain algorithms. Algorithms don't pull triggers, Garrett. Bullets don't read code. They fly through air. The air out there is a blender. The thermal updraft from the baked sand is pushing that dust devil in reverse. If I hold left 1.2, I'm going to miss 3 feet to the right. Respectfully, Chief, the solver is calibrated to a 99% accuracy rating based on Garrett. She cut him off, not with anger, but with the exhausted patience of a woman who had seen the math fail. The computer is a tool. It is not a god. It only knows what you tell it, and it cannot see the ghost in the wind. She reached up and dialed her elevation. 11.4 mils. That much was physics. Gravity is a constant, but the wind is a living, breathing, malicious entity. I'm holding right 0.5, she said. Garrett shifted uncomfortably on his mat. Chief, you're holding into the mechanical wind call. The bullet is going to drift right. Watch the trace. She settled her breathing. The burning heat of the mat seeped through her canvas pants, baking her skin. She welcomed it. It was real. It wasn't the air-conditioned, sterile air of the TOC or the PR office. It was friction. She exhaled, finding the natural respiratory pause. The crosshairs hovered off the right edge of the white steel target. To a computer, it was a guaranteed miss. She pressed the trigger. The rifle roared, kicking back with a blunt, punishing force. A cloud of fine, talcum-like dust exploded around the muzzle brake, coating her teeth in grit. Through the scope, she fought the recoil, keeping her eye in the shadow. Because of the heat and the velocity, the bullet's path was visible, a localized distortion in the air, a tiny flying whirlpool called a vapor trail or trace. It arced high into the boiling mirage. For the first 800 yards, it drifted left, exactly as Garrett's computer predicted, pushed by the wind at their position, but then it hit the 1,200-yard mark. The thermal updraft, the invisible wall of heat rising off the baked desert floor. The trace suddenly snapped to the right, catching the reverse current of the dust devil, riding the chaotic air mass back toward the center line. A full second passed. Ting. A faint metallic ring drifted back across the desert. Through the scope, a fresh grey smudge appeared dead center on the white steel silhouette. Garrett was dead silent. She could hear his rapid breathing through the electronic headset. She cycled the bolt. The hot brass casing ejected, flying over her shoulder and landing in the dust with a soft thud. Impact, Garrett finally whispered. Dead center. But the algorithm is a safety net for people who don't want to feel the environment, she said, rolling off the rifle and sitting up. She wiped a mixture of sweat and dust from her forehead. When you're out there, Garrett, and the stakes are real, the environment doesn't care about your math. It will lie to you. It will hide things in the terrain. You have to look at the dirt. You have to look at the leaves. You have to feel the pressure drop on the skin of your cheek. She reached back, picked up the hot brass casing from the dirt, and tossed it to him. He caught it, fumbling slightly as the heat bit into his fingers. Keep that, she told him. Whenever you want to trust the screen more than your own eyes, hold that brass. Remind yourself that the computer doesn't have to carry the weight of a miss. You do. He looked at the brass, then up at her. The cocky, tech-savvy kid was gone. In his eyes, she saw the first genuine spark of understanding, the terrifying realization that the ultimate responsibility couldn't be outsourced to a microchip. She looked away, staring out across the blinding expanse of the desert. She realized, with a heavy, sinking feeling in her stomach, that she sounded exactly like Blake. She had become the veteran. She was the ghost now, haunting the firing line, telling the rookies that the wind was too strong for their machines. A week later, the brass finally cornered her. Commander Baker didn't call her to an office this time. He ambushed her in the armory. She was stripping down the .338, scrubbing the bolt face with a wire brush and a heavy dose of solvent. The smell of ammonia and carbon was a comforting blanket. "You missed your appointments, Cross," Baker said, standing in the doorway, his uniform impeccably pressed. He looked entirely out of place among the racks of heavy weaponry and the stench of CLP. "I was running qualification ranges in Nyland, sir," she replied, not looking up. She scrubbed harder at a stubborn piece of carbon buildup. "Those ranges were covered. You had direct orders from the PAO to attend the summit. I am a sniper, Commander, not a spokesperson. My job is to put rounds on target, not to smile for cameras and talk about glass ceilings." Baker stepped into the room, the door clicking shut behind him. The hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly felt very loud. "Do you know why we put you on that mountain, Beck?" he asked, dropping the formalities. His voice was lower, stripped of the polished officer cadence. She stopped brushing. She looked up at him. "Because I had the highest qualification scores in the platoon. Because I could make the shot." "No," Baker said bluntly. "There are 3 men in this armory right now who could have made that shot. Blake could have made it if his knee hadn't been failing." The words felt like a physical slap. The iron box in her mind rattled. "Then why?" "Because we needed the narrative," Baker said, his eyes cold and utterly pragmatic. "The war is changing. Funding is changing. The public is tired of watching the same guys kick down the same doors. We needed a win that looked different. We needed a headline that made the politicians feel good about signing the checks. You were a calculated risk, a very expensive, highly trained piece of PR. She stared at him. The sheer, naked cynicism of it took her breath away. It wasn't about merit. It wasn't about the math. It was about marketing. "And if I had missed?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "If the wind had taken it, and Royce had lived? Then we would have buried the file, blamed the weather, and you would be quietly rotated to a training command in Virginia for the rest of your career. An experiment that didn't pan out." He stepped closer, resting his hands on the metal workbench. "But you didn't miss. You bypassed the computer, you read the canyon draft, and you put a round through a man's spine at 3 miles. You did the impossible. And because you did the impossible, you belong to us. You don't get to hide in the desert and play instructor. You're going to put on your dress blues, you're going to go to the summits, and you're going to smile." Her hand gripped the wire brush so tightly the metal handle dug into her palm, right over the scar from the scree slope. She felt the anger flare, hot, bright, and violent. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to tell him about the 10 seconds of flight time. She wanted to tell him about dry heaving in the snow, about the mortars tearing the mountain apart, about the ghost of Dominic Royce that sat in the corner of her bedroom every night. But she didn't, because looking at Baker's perfectly clean, uncalloused hands, she realized something. He was a tourist. He managed the violence, but he didn't touch it. He didn't know what it smelled like. He was trying to control her with spreadsheets and PR schedules, because it was the only power he had. She slowly placed the wire brush on the bench. She picked up a clean rag and wiped the excess solvent off the rifle bolt. "No, sir," she said, her voice perfectly level. Baker's eyes narrowed. "That is a direct order, Chief. You can court-martial me, Commander. You can strip my trident. You can put me in Leavenworth." She slid the bolt back into the receiver of the rifle, the machined steel locking into place with a heavy, satisfying clack. "But if you put me on a stage and hand me a microphone, I am going to tell them the truth." Baker froze. "What truth?" "I'm going to tell them that I didn't shoot a terrorist for freedom or democracy. I'm going to tell them that I shot a man because you told me to, and that I spent 3 days lying in my own filth to do it. I'm going to tell them that the military doesn't care about breaking glass ceilings. It just cares about finding new people to pull the trigger. I'm going to tell them exactly what it looks like when a .416 round hits a human body. And I won't use the sanitized language. I will describe the blood. I will describe the dirt. I will show them the ghost." She turned to face him fully, letting him see the dead, flat look in her eyes. The look a person gets when they've stared through a scope for so long that they forget how to blink. "You want a poster, Commander, but you built a killer. You can't put a killer on a morning talk show and expect her not to bleed on the carpet." The silence in the armory was absolute. Baker stared at her, the blood slowly draining from his face. He was a smart man. He ran the calculus. He saw the threat, and he knew she wasn't bluffing. She had nothing left to lose. Her soul was already dented. Her career meant nothing compared to the weight of the brass casing in her pocket. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his perfectly knotted tie. "You're a liability, Cross," he finally muttered, stepping back from the bench. "I'm a weapon, sir," she corrected him. "Point me at a target or put me back in the rack, but don't ask me to dance." Baker didn't say another word. He turned on his heel and walked out of the armory, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind him. She stood there for a long time, listening to the hum of the lights. The anger faded, leaving behind that familiar, heavy emptiness. She had won the battle, but she knew the war was over. They wouldn't deploy her again. She was too stubborn, too broken, too uncontrollable. She would spend the rest of her days on the desert ranges, teaching kids like Garrett how to read the dust devils, passing on the terrible burden of the math and the wind. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the .416 casing, the one from the mountain. She held it up to the harsh fluorescent light. It was just a piece of formed brass, stupid, dead, inanimate, but it held the weight of the entire world. She thought about Thomas Blake, sitting on a porch in Montana, watching the fish. She wondered if the silence drove him crazy, too. She wondered if he still woke up tasting copper. She smiled. It was the same raw, imperfect smile that had cracked her lip on the mountain. It wasn't happy. It was just the only physical reaction her body had left to process the sheer, profound absurdity of her existence. She was Rebecca Cross. She had made a 3-mile shot in a screaming crosswind. She had killed a warlord, defied the brass, and secured her place in a history book she never wanted to be in. She set the brass casing on the workbench next to the rifle. She turned out the lights, plunging the armory into darkness, and walked out into the heat of the afternoon. The wind was blowing off the ocean, kicking up dust in the parking lot. She didn't check her kestrel. She didn't need to. She could feel exactly which way it was breaking. The shot from the mountain changed Beck's life, but not in the way the history books will tell it. True survival isn't just about pulling the trigger. It's about carrying the ghost when the brass stops watching. We tell the stories the official reports try to sanitize, stripping away the polish to show the raw, imperfect reality of the operators in the shadows. If this story struck a nerve, don't let it get buried by the algorithm. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video to keep the real, grounded stories alive. Stand by for the next operation.